Good afternoon, bon après-midi, bonjour, bienvenue. Si vous...
Welcome. If you want to join us, Your Excellencies, thank you. Welcome to IDRC. I am Jean Lebel. I'm president for the center.
Lebel, and I'm the president of the International Development Research Center. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you today and to welcome also three guests. His Excellency the Ambassador of Mongolia, our guest of honor Sergio Bitar, as well as the Secretary General of IDEA, Mr. Yves Leterme. So let's give them a warm welcome. So it is my pleasure today to welcome you for the launch of a book, the book of our friend Sergio Bitar, Democratic Transitions, Conversation with World Leaders. Mr. Bitar is the president of Chile's Foundation for Democracy, a director of Global Trends and Latin America's Future Project at the Inter-American Dialogue, and which is an internationally, there's a buzz. Do you hear the buzz? Is there a buzz? You don't hear the buzz? I'm hearing a buzz. I'm getting distracted by a buzz. There's a buzz. Can we? It's just over here? Okay, good. So I will have to do with the buzz. Maybe this is 4,000 hertz, roughly. I can recognize that. So let me restart. Mr. Bitar is the president of Chile's Foundation for Democracy, a director of the Global Trends and Latin America's Future Project at the Inter-American Dialogue, an internationally recognized author and editor, as well as a very good friend of IDRC. Sergio and his colleague Abraham Lowenthal, who cannot be with us today, recently published an important study of the role played by politicians in bringing their countries out of the authoritarian rules into democracy. Democratic Transition, Conversation with World Leaders present the personal reflection of leaders that went through these transitions in 9 countries. Convaincant, lumineux et opportun, les dialogues entre...
Convincing, luminous, and coming at the right time. This dialogue between the authors and the various speakers teach us a lot about how democratic transitions have been carried out and still can be in a world that is constantly changing, which we can see every day. The successes and the failures of each of these situations allow us to learn important lessons and give good advice to many different members of society. And few people are as well placed as Sergio to edit such a work. As some of you know, Sergio was minister in Chile under 3 governments. That of Salvador Allende, where he was Minister of Mines. Then he was imprisoned. Then he was exiled into the south of the country as a political prisoner at Dawson Island. And then he was exiled in the U.S. and Venezuela before coming back as one of the leaders of the movement for the democratization of Chile. After, he was Minister of Education under the presidency of Ricardo Lagos and Minister of Infrastructure under the first government of President Bachelet. He not only was appointed minister, but he was also a senator for 8 years. So he occupied positions to which he was elected. The story of the life and career of Sergio, and also the reflections that he and Mr. Lowenthal added to their book, inspires me as the president of IDRC. This work perfectly illustrates the kind of work that we do in various regions of the world. And over lunch, I gave that example of South Africa, where IDRC, at the beginning of the 90s, supported many research projects
that were meant to provide transition towards democracy after the apartheid regime. And we sponsor research with researchers that look at, at reform of institution, that look at transition of parliament, reform of judicial system, infrastructure, water management, everything that you can think that a democratic society needs after many years of regime that was excluded the vast majority of the population. To our surprise, when Nelson Mandela was elected in '94, over half of the cabinet was constituted by people that had received funding as researcher from IDRC during their career. So you see, that knowledge, innovation, and solution can make a long way into politics. But we strongly believe also at IDRC it's not about, creating political leader. It's creating citizens that can make decisions and inform different sectors of society, whether it's business, whether it's academia, whether it's policy, through a rigorous scientific process. And this approach has also been taken place in Chile. Since 1970, we have approved over $37 million of support to research projects in Chile. And in the 70s and 80s, during the Pinochet dictatorship, IDRC was among the very few, if not the unique donor that provided funding for social science. In fact, at IDRC, we are very proud to use a statement that Ricardo Lagos, a former president, made one day, saying that IDRC was the agency that kept the possibility of having IDs alive during the dictatorship. This statement is an enormous source of pride in our organization. It is proof sensitive that the work we do in South Africa or in Chile or in other places, more recently we have been quite active in Myanmar, helps to prepare nation for democratic transition. It helped to build civic society institutions. It strengthened democracy and forged strong relations among like-minded government. And this year wouldn't be fair without, saying that we mark 75 years of relationship of diplomatic relationship between Canada and Chile. And Ambassador Silva, thank you for being with us, the Ambassador of Chile and Canada. And when we mark this milestone, we do something more than merely acknowledge the passage of time. We celebrate those things that we share and that serve as the foundation of our relationship. A commitment to promoting democracy and human rights worldwide, and a vision for the ways in which economic opportunities, security and justice, and social welfare should be conducted. So I cannot think of no more appropriate way to celebrate this 75th anniversary with having as a guest speaker Sergio, that will talk in detail about his experience and his work, as well as the one of numbers of leaders across the world that went from authoritarian regime to democracy. But before doing so, I want to acknowledge also Yves Leterme. Yves is the Secretary General of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, an organization that has been created 21 years ago and that is constituted by a group of 38 countries, Yves, 28 countries that are supporting you. The organization initiated this book project and will take the stand in a few minutes. I will leave a words for time for Yves to deliver you a few words. But IDEA is supporting, important work, all committed towards democracy and electoral assistance, supporting sustainable democratic change, providing comparative knowledge, assisting in democratic reform, and influencing policies and politics. And IDEA has been there for 21 years, and IDRC has been at many times supporting IDEA, and we are exploring common projects currently to pursue this journey together. IDEA has a membership of 28 countries. And this year, it was with great pleasure that Mongolia was elected as chair of the council, the board of IDEA. And we have today the pleasure of welcoming the ambassador of Mongolia to Canada, Mr. Altangerel. And we will start by hearing the few reflections of Mr. Altangerel. So, Mr. Altangerel, please. Thank you.
Mr. Sergio Bitar, Secretary General, Yves Leterme, President, Mr. President Jean Lebel, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to deliver short remarks, share my reflection, and offer congratulations at this special event. I would like to extend many sincere thanks to the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance and the International Development Research Center for co-organizing this book launching event. I would like to congratulate book authors Sergio Bitar and Abraham Lowenthal for their tremendous works and impressive insights on how political leaders helped their countries moving towards democratic transitions. 26 years ago, Mongolia chose its development path to embrace rule of law, democratic governance, market economy, and open society. Mongolia carried out peaceful reforms and successful transition to a democratic society that cherishes human rights and freedom. Democratic parliamentary election held in Mongolia in 1990 was not only first of its kind in the region, but it was fully democratic and free. Since then, my country had 6 such elections. Mongolia is one of the role models in our region in that regard. Mongolia has adopted in 1992 its first democratic constitution and established first independent electoral institution. We have been developing our electoral legal framework and voting systems. Mongolia has been considered a good example in the regards in our region. Therefore, we are pleased to share our achievements, challenges, and in effort to develop and strengthen democracy in Asia. Mesdames et Messieurs, cette année, la Mongolie préside international.
This year, Mongolia has the presidency of the IDEA Institute, and in order to do this, Mongolia has chosen these themes. The lessons of democratization, which is the main topic, has not been chosen by chance. This is in order to animate dialogue and exchanges on experiences of democratic values. So this gives us a good opportunity to share the unique experience that we have had in a democratic transition over the past 26 years. Mongolia shares this with other new democracies such as Myanmar and Kazakhstan and others in order to strengthen democracy by improving the judiciary and the legal system. There is a workshop that was organized on democratization in Mongolia. This is one of the first events that we organized in the context of this chairmanship. So Mongolia shares these same issues of democratization with other Asian countries. Other forums have been planned. There will be something in New York and in Geneva. The Democratic Forum will be organized at the end of this year in Stockholm.
Today's book launching is one of those side events we support as part of our chairmanship. Democratic transitions, conversation with the world leaders. This book is about leadership, sacrifices for democracy and freedom. It tells us how successful democratic transitions depend on many factors, domestically and externally. The book had been published in many languages and received extensive reviews from leading democratic thinkers. I'm looking forward to seeing Mongolian edition of the book in near future. This is a book I want my fellow Mongolians, young people, to read and spread. We gathered here to celebrate democracy because we believe in it. Thank you.
Et maintenant, j'aimerais inviter M. Yves Leterme, le secrétaire.
Now I'd like to invite Mr. Yves Leterme, the Secretary General of the IDEA Institute, to come and speak to us.
Gentlemen, first of all, I will be very brief since I'm the last obstacle between now and the real speaker of this afternoon. But let me, maybe to start, say threefold thank you. First of all, maybe a bit special, thank you to Canada. I'm born in Ypres in the Flanders fields, liberated by Canadian soldiers. In the whole of my political tenure leading my country, I experienced that we always stood at the same side, shoulder on shoulder with your leaders, with your people, and now you have Canada, we have Canada in our community of member states, really deserving a lot of respect for your engagement. Great country, great people, thank you for that. The number two is thank you to Jean Lebel. My country was launched by Philippe Lebel, who is a bit different to Jean Lebel, but still, in my personal life, maybe Jean Lebel plays an even so important positive role. I would say that we are very pleased. Nous sommes vraiment très heureux d'être accueillis ici à Ottawa par.
We're very pleased to be welcomed here in Ottawa by the International Development Research Centre. I don't think we could imagine any better partner to launch this book here in Canada. We met each other 2 or 3 weeks ago, Jean and I, and we were there with Madame Choquette, who's Canadian, but who's working with us in Stockholm, who will stay in Stockholm. She won't be coming back to Canada so soon. But we are here to launch this book and to have conversations with your government leaders. Thank you very much for facilitating this meeting.
Now already, big thanks to Sergio Bitar. We didn't know each other from beforehand, before we met in the framework of International IDEA, but I would say that I would like to testify here that I have a lot of respect for your work, your personal engagement throughout your personal political life, and also the key role you played in this project of writing this book. You were, just to add as a footnote, but it's not a footnote in history, you were one of these people that made a difference for your country and that made your country one of the most successful examples of democratic transitions in Latin America and also on the global level. That's to your credit, and thank you for that. Besides threefold saying thank you, let me say a few words again about International IDEA. Indeed, 28, very close to 29 member states, and Brazil is about to join us in the course of the next weeks. International IDEA is about electoral assistance, it's about constitution building processes, it's about participation and representation, the quality of democracy, support to political party management, and last but not least, it's about trying to have these mutually reinforcing interaction between democracy and development. We are headquartered in Stockholm, have offices in lots of parts of the globe, and we work with something like, thanks to our member states, 160 to 170 people working for International IDEA. The book was launched by my predecessor, so I have no merit to stand here in front of you. It was launched by Vidar Helgesen, currently a minister in the Norwegian government, and the idea of Vidar Helgesen, Secretary General of International IDEA until autumn 2013, was, besides all theoretical research, scientific research, and overviews of the technicalities and the, I would say, the scientific approaches and aspects of democratic transitions, to have a collection of testimonials of people that, besides institutions, besides constitutions, elections and so on, that as a person really made a difference. And that's the reason why, together with the authors, they selected selected together some 9 countries: Indonesia, the Philippines, South Africa, Ghana, Poland, Spain, Mexico, Brazil and Chile, and that they went out with a lot of knowledge and preparation about the specific history of each of these countries, that they were sent out, Sergio Bitar and Yves Lewenthal, to interview the key people from Thabo Mbeki till Mr. Kwasniewski, the former president of Poland, in all of these countries, to interview them and to ask them what at the end of the day really made a difference in terms of succeeding in these democratic transitions, what were the challenges, sometimes also the failures, and what kind of lessons can we draw from that experience to be helpful for the current and future democratic transitions. Because democracy is not something static, it's always evolving, but it's very important to learn from the past and to use this knowledge and experience for the future. And I think that's one of the ambitions of the book. It's also the ambition of International IDEA. This book is only a small piece of our work, and we are currently brainstorming, trying to build up new research and possibilities to use this knowledge, bring this to new countries. In fact, we already do this. We are active, for instance, in Myanmar, in some other countries, Bhutan and so on, Nepal, Bolivia, name it, all countries that are currently struggling with the issue of the process of a democratic transition. I promised you to be very brief, and I'm a former politician, but still I will stick to my promises. But I would like to close, I would like to make a giant leap, so to say, in the speech that was prepared, and I would like to close with quoting with a text that was sent to me by Moncef Marzouki. It was sent to be used last week in Paris, and I used it also, and it makes a kind of bridge between the content of the book and what is happening currently all over the globe, including in Brussels, my cherished country, my nation. And I quote Moncef Marzouki, whom, as you know, was the president of Tunisia and who signed a preface to the book. I quote him. It's in French. I hope this is not a problem for any one of you. So I quote him.
Without wanting to appear pessimistic or alarmist, please allow me, former president of Tunisia at a historical moment in its history, allow me also to express my concern, my worry, my concern in terms of the future of democracy, where it already exists or where it is in the process of coming into effect. Until now, we have always opposed democracy and dictatorship. Well, today, this opposition with democracy on the one hand and dictatorship on the other hand seems obsolete. Everything that we've learned over these past decades, without wanting to draw the consequences and conclusions which are necessary, is that dictatorship is both the mother and the daughter of terrorism. The mother, because it engenders, through its corruption and its injustice, it gives rise to terrorism. But in another way, it nourishes, it feeds on it, as presenting itself as an answer to its violence and inhumanity, but with an even greater violence and even greater inhumanity. And the key question of this era is the following. Will democracy be able to end terrorism, or will terrorism put an end to democracy? Because here you have to look at the growing interdependence between an existing historic democracy and the new democracies that are currently happening, countries that are being democratized. If in these first established democracies, these countries that are for the moment the example to be followed, and should the security concerns override rights and liberties, well then new emerging democracies will be subject to even stronger pressures and will only be able to imitate them in that respect. If these emerging democracies fall under the repeated assault of terrorism and of anti-democratic ideologies, our countries will be even more sources of violence and instability, bringing established democracies towards a greater authoritarian state, and bringing a war of civilization. Faced by such a great danger which threatens the call to liberty and fraternity between peoples, we have urgently to engage in a common undertaking to examine democracies at various stages of development in order to face this issue of terrorism.
Between the book that will be presented now by Sergio Bitar and our future work. Thank you very much for your presence, and thank you for paying attention to me. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général de IDEA.
Thank you.
All yours.
Sergio, je pense que vous avez...
You will have your presentation, and then we will move seamlessly into question period with the audience. And it's a pleasure to welcome you and to see you again. And please, merci. Bienvenue. Welcome.
Thank you, John. Well, I have first to thank the generosity of the words of Jean in the invitation, and the generosity of the words of Yves Leterme. He has been a Prime Minister of Belgium, a Minister of Foreign Affairs, so I ponder your words. Thank you very much. And for the ambassadors that are here, and I would like to also thank every one of you, because that means to come to a meeting on democracy and transitions means that you really like the subject and you are committed to the subject. So, but let me start saying that this is not a book on the past, it's a book on the future. Because in fact, what we have done, and what Vidar Helgesen, as Yves Leterme mentioned, and himself, they wanted at the beginning to help the Arab Spring. This came out because of the Arab Spring. And I remember quite well when I was in Washington after we left government in 2010, and the president of the National Democratic Institute called me and he said, Mubarak has fallen. I want you to go to Egypt and talk to the parties. We have an office there, and to talk to them and see and explain how you see transitions. You lived yours, and there are many others. So we went there, and I realized immediately that whenever we visited a political leader of a party in Egypt, and my friends from the US start talking, they will not talk anymore. So they didn't like the US people. I realized that. And so I have to tell, we didn't either, because these guys, Nixon and others, supported the military coup in Chile. So I was in prison. And so the other guys will say, me too. How long have you been in prison? 1 year only. I've been 5 years. So we started talking with the Egyptians when they felt that there was some commonality. But I remember that my first impressions were that it was impossible. Every leader didn't have a party. He thought that he had a party. And everyone wanted to be president. So no concept of coalition or party or grassroots. So when I told him, well, we built a coalition. Almost all transitions have built coalitions that didn't work well, and my feeling was that it was not working. Then I met with the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. I remember my impressions. One was very rigid, and he said, I have a doctorate in theology. So I said, probably because he held his doctorate in PhD in theology, he's rigid for politics. But I listened badly, because it's not theology, it was geology. So the guy, but afterwards there were some deputies, and the deputies that I felt that have been in the Congress were quite politicians. They were talking politics, not religion. At the end, you realize that many people use religion for defending their own political positions. It's not religion the issue, it's politics. So then when we arrived to Stockholm, I remember then the idea said, how to help those people? But we would like to help analyzing transitions in several countries, not only in one country, or not only in Latin America. Joan? Where is the, no, I don't see the, to move this. Thank you, Joan. So he said, and I would like to listen to the presidents that led those transitions, because they made the bread is done by them. So could you do that? Go everywhere and get these presidents, analyze each transition, understand the meaning of the transition, to get the sense of what they did, and to get the deep things of what they did. It wasn't easy, but we said that could be a very intelligent, interesting case. And those are the countries that we visited, those were the presidents that we interviewed. In order to interview each one, we had to study deeply the transition. You cannot go and ask stupid questions because nobody will answer. So you have to know the issues. And then we got also an expert in each country that will help us to understand, and they wrote on each chapter, on each country. Each chapter is independent. You can read different countries. So we have two friends here from Mexico. I was telling them that they should read the Mexican. But the former president of Mexico, Cedillo, that is interviewed, it was very hard to get him. It's the first interview about his government, and in fact, it's not a transition, what happened in Mexico, so I think the word doesn't adjust. It was a change because there are elections in Mexico, it's not a dictatorship. But anyhow, they teach a lot. The Venezuelans now are interested in the Mexican case because they think it's not a transition either, but they are having problems on how to deal with evolution to democracy. So we did this, and we built a text that you will see that combine real politics and practices with political science. So my co-author, he's a political scientist, and when I accompanied him in the US to one of two discussions on political science, these were discussing because it was not sufficiently based on academics, on measuring or causalities. And politics is not like that, so we combine that, and that could be useful for academics, could be useful for students, but also it's useful and mostly for leaders that are going to start or are fighting for a change. So there is an introduction in each chapter for people that do not know that transition, a timeline so you can follow the timing of each event, a bio sketch of the president, a discussion on leadership, and further reading. So having said that, I say always I would have liked very much, when we started fighting against our dictatorship, to have a book like this one, to learn what others have done, to think in the ways others did, to see options. But our main problem was, can we, in those different situations, identify common issues, or it's just a story for each different story? And we made an effort, and we came out with some recurrent issues that we found in all cases that appear differently, with different emphasis, with different connection, with different interaction, but can help, for instance, governments. As Jean was saying, well, for instance, in our case, supporting IDRC think tanks, supporting many countries and governments. Ambassadors of many of those countries are here, receiving people in asylum in their embassies, protecting their human rights, protecting the democratic leaders. It's very important. Probably you don't realize when you make a decision of that kind. You think that that's something completely simple, but it helps the spirit of the people that are doing there, and that protect them physically. So what Lagos was saying, I think it's a correct perception of what to do. We added a chapter on women. So the question was, how did women participate in these transitions? And what did they get afterwards when new constitutions were built, about their rights, about the equality of rights between men and women, and their participation in politics? And that is a very important chapter, because the person that did that went along in those same countries interviewing women that played a role, and they come with very interesting ideas that could be helpful. I don't know if for Saudi women, but for women that are fighting in other places to have more rights in terms of how to act, how to be involved. Now, when we started our discussions and we interviewed President Aylwin, for instance, the case of Chile, and the question that we put to everyone, did you use other experiences as a reference? And the answer was generally no. That's why I think this is very useful. We use, for instance, in Chile, the experience of Argentina and Brazil. They failed, the Argentinians. Alfonsín didn't last the whole period for economic reasons. And Brazil, the first president that they elected died the day before he had to take power. So how to adjust that? It was just beginning. But I would say that for any leader that is now dealing with these issues, that would be very helpful. And also for international organizations that can help these processes. Now, what are these main conclusions that I will present? First, we have separated 4 stages that you can see. Normally it's not such a rigid thing, but that helps to think. The democratization, how to put the forces together, how to fight the authoritarian regime when you win, or if you can call it a win, because normally transitions are negotiations, how to make the transfer of power in a way that doesn't disrupt the whole thing and those that are coming can govern, and finally how to institutionalize the process. And then we went to say, what are the main 10 imperatives? I would call them, well, at least suggestions that come out. The first thing that we learned in all cases, that you moved gradually and incrementally. That's very important, because when you are in the place and the moment, you see that that increment that appeared today to be marginal, at that time was critical. It was a big step. For instance, the discussions in South Africa concerning the provisional constitution was a big fighting. It looks incremental, and people later today, you will see in all countries people criticizing transitions, saying, well, you were not courageous. Why did you didn't negotiate in this way, or didn't do this other way, as if you can solve all the problems immediately for the future? No. So we realized that all leaders will discuss a lot. Should I wait till I get more, or should I move the limit, the fence, and then to create a larger space? And there is a sentence that is quite go across the book by President Aylwin, when he said, I will do en la medida de lo posible, as far as the possibility exists. Some people will say that means that these guys don't want to do what they can, but what is possible. Who decides what is possible? And the other vision is we do what is possible, and we move ahead the space of the possible. We change what is possible as far as you do. So that's, I would say, the Polish show the same thing. That's one major thing. A second one is that when you are fighting against a dictatorship or authoritarian government, you have lots of grievances, corruption, violations of human rights, problems of every kind. But if you just say that you are fighting against them because of all these things, it's not enough. In all the cases, there is a vision. The leaders, they project a positive vision of the future. So they have to say, and we have the sentences and the quotes of many of them, we can build a better future, we can build freedom, we can do this and that. So people feel that they are going to something better than just vengeance or just crushing or just sanctioning what was bad in the past. A third element that came out is that you leaders spend much time in building agreements and coalition within democratic forces. Normally democratic forces are split, parties they dispute among themselves, and social movements are disconnected from political parties. So it's a big task to put political parties together and at the same time to connect with social movements and make the whole thing synchronize and concentrate enough strength to put pressure on the government and social mobilization. In all cases, social mobilization was extremely important. You don't negotiate if you don't have your own strength. And strength comes from social mobilization. People go to the street, fight, and expose their life, and that's very critical. But these coalitions of workers, students, women, human rights movements, churches. In many cases, the church played a very important role. In Brazil, it was very, very important. In Poland, it was very important because the Polish nation is quite linked to the Catholic Church, and that creates a feeling of union and community. Then, I would say that the other main problem that is hard to achieve looks very simple. Create spaces for dialogue. Create spaces for dialogue. So in all cases, at the end, when the people realize that you cannot do it alone and you are sinking if you don't move, or that you think that the other guy is awful, and the reciprocity. Once you start talking to each other, you see the faces, you create some sort of trust, and you have at the end of the day a community of interest in your country. You don't want to destroy completely your country or destroy yourself. So you have to find, normally you have some people with moderate views within the authoritarian government and also within the democratic forces open that. Now, the dialogue has to be created, and that's very important internationally because you can help in some of the cases we are analyzing now how international organizations can help to put a space for dialogue so that people will come, that they cannot do sometimes that within their own country because they will be qualified as traitors by the other one. So to put them together, many times those are secret talks. The Polish, the South Africans, all they tell that at the beginning they had secret talks. So protecting dialogue is quite important, and all countries show that. So you have to build bridges, you have to define minimum programs, you have to establish a floor where you can then, if you win, govern. A fifth phenomena that appears normally is the control of the military and the police. You cannot do anything. Normally the military are quite important, either openly because they govern, or they are behind the government and you cannot manage within them. the government. And you cannot face the military or crush the military. You have to find a way out. And so putting the military under the control of the civilians is a very critical issue, and you will find in all countries different ways to do that. Also, in all countries where that happened, you have to separate the police from the armed forces. All of them separated the police from the armed forces, because normally in those dictatorships you put the police within the armed forces. And you need the police because you cannot expel everyone, because you need public order. And at the same time, you have to re-educate the police in a way that they can change their mind from repression to protection of the citizen. It's not an easy process. For instance, Indonesia, Habibie describes quite well that he, at the very beginning, he had to do that. And also President Ramos from Philippines, he was the head of the police during the previous period. He was part of the government of President Marcos, the dictator. And then they splitted that. And also, even the most simple things of having a minister of defense that is a civilian becomes a very critical issue in all transitions, and that tends to happen. Of course, it's different depending on the country. Those things that I am saying differ in the way, for instance, in Poland, they didn't have that problem because they had 200,000 Soviet soldiers in Poland, and it was different who you were fighting with or who you wanted to get out of that. Then the issue of constitutions. Normally, constitutions are prepared under when a crisis comes out. You don't see constitution built in a democracy, so there's less experience to do that. But the constitution is a major challenge. It means a new vision of the community. It's more than just the rules or the articles. It's the feeling that you are building something together, a kind of society you are building together. So what is the role of the military, the role of the human rights, decentralization, regional autonomy, social and property rights, electoral systems, the judiciary, and now the problems of the environment, the political system, the role of the state. And it differs, but some cases you don't do a new constitution and you have amendments, but you always change the constitution or have a new constitution. That's very important. That appears in all the cases, and it's interesting to see the political conditions for doing that. And what you learn is at the end, what is important is that you put everyone inside. You cannot build a constitution for a group. It's for everyone. And to find mechanisms without the constitution where you can solve uncertainties in a way that are acceptable to each one. So the procedures within the constitution are as important as the dogmatic part or the principles that are in which you are based to do that. Then I was told that I would like to say a few things in French. Well, la question de la justice.
The issue of justice is always important, and it depends on the country. In some countries, an amnesty law was signed. For example, in Spain, there was a law of amnesty, and even now, if you see what's being discussed, the criticism of Felipe González, that's very strong. They're saying, well, you didn't do that. You accepted the amnesty law. And when he explains his experience, in his interview, he says that what he did, that was when he had to let the people who were prisoners, the people who were on his side who were in prison. So you can see that you can see the transition differently. In general, people analyze the democratization later with a much more critical vision, of course, with hindsight. So they see, well, you did something great when you did it, but then 10, 20 years later, people say, the young people say, well, you were very conservative, you didn't do everything that could have been done. But that's just the nature of these transitions. I remember clearly that Mbeki was talking about that. He said all of the criticism that people are making of us, well, it's huge because the blacks thought that the whites were controlling everything back then, and now it's the blacks who are rich. So there's always a confusion in transition between the political transition and the economic transition. The fight against poverty, that's not the same thing. That's why it's really interesting what Yves was saying, to see democracy and development. These are parallel processes that happen at the same time. They're interrelated, but it's not the same thing. You can't say that because there's democracy, poverty will disappear. It's maybe easier for it to disappear, but it's not a necessary corollary. So justice and collective memory are really important. Now we're looking to the importance of collective memory in arriving at a stronger democracy. If you forget, or if people who have experienced things die, and there's no work at building a collective memory, which is part of the wealth of the country, well, you can just fall back into the same trap as previously. So this issue of memory is very important.
Manage that. Then all countries, all governments were thinking, all presidents, on how to build parties. Normally, those transitions starts with very weak parties. I think that's part of the problem of Egypt. And now it's much more complicated. But the support, international support, or the need to strengthen parties is quite important, because otherwise you don't have any space for selecting candidates, preparing programs, expanding your presence in the society, expressing visions of the society. So normally in those countries that are now coming to the fore in terms of transitions, where tribes are important, not nations. Oh, there are many tribes within the nation. How do you build that? And how do you create parties under this perspective? It's more difficult. And then I would go to the last two elements. Economic policy. When I saw these experiences, it's my conclusion that the economy was not the leading force that moved the process of transition. Transitions are generally pushed by the will for freedom, the will for peace, the will for ending hate, the will for ending polarization. It's more principles that are involved, and the desire of human being to become free and to live with others, and to live with others in a way that you don't separate. If the economy helps, it can be an obstacle or it can be an accelerator. But there are basic conditions for making transitions easier. So we analyze that. And that means, that's, I think, one of the main problems for Venezuela today. So we can then see how these elements can play into in the space of things that are happening now. The same with the constitution. I remember a conversation a few weeks ago, before the elections in Myanmar, of the new president. Well, you know that there is an article in the constitution of Myanmar where you cannot be candidate for the presidency if one of your sons is a foreigner. And Aung San, she had a son that I think has a British passport. So when Lagos, the president of Chile, was there presenting the book that came out in Burmese in January, and he talked to the general who was commanding the whole thing, and he said, we are discussing if we are going to suspend this part of the because we had the right. We could suspend that, so she could be a candidate for the presidency. And then we realized that they didn't suspend that, and she had to nominate an assistant or a person who became the president. So again, the constitutions are quite important because it allows you to move ahead or not. But in terms of the economics, you need a floor to have a transition. And then we analyzed deeply also, and we asked all the presidents about external support. All of them, I would say with the exception of Rawlings in Ghana, they said it's not the main factor. It's always marginal. What happens within a country happens because of the forces within the country, not because it comes a foreign power to impose anything. What Rawlings said at the time was that, because we asked him, why did you accept to move to a democracy, to a constitution that has a multi-party system? And his own thinking was based on tribes, and to give power to different tribes and to have an assembly of this as the basic for democratic system. And well, he said, well, the Americans came here and they said that they will not provide any economic support. I am a pragmatic guy. Then he signed an agreement with the IMF. Well, that depends on the country, but normally in all cases depends on what's going on inside. So I suppose that Rawlings was giving an excuse, but he had to do that if he wanted to keep a country together. And then how to help, and you have lots of ways to do it, but basically to support democratic forces, to protect human rights of those forces, to help creating think tanks and develop programs and thinking before the change is produced, and helping to know how do you poll, how do you organize a political party. There are many things you can do internationally that can quite helpful, and they come out from what the presidents say. We went further at the end and we said, how do you see the future? What are the elements that will affect future transitions? Well, nobody said much because they were intelligent people. It's hard to imagine how things will happen. What Matsugi was saying that you read, really? The issue of terrorism was not there. The implications of terrorism in terms of security versus democracy, and the people need security. Without that you don't have democracy, but excessive security will kill democracy and privacy and freedom. So how we equilibrate that for the future? The role of Islam was not has gone so far as now. But I remember quite well, because we asked the only president that we interviewed that belonged to a country, a Muslim country, that made this transition, and that was Habibi. And I remember we asked him, what's going on with Islam? And he said, the challenges in the Middle East, the so-called Arab Spring, are not an Islamic problem. They are problems of justice and equitable distribution. Some people use the Islamic headliners as a means to get more attention and money and control. Again, the issue of using religion for political objectives rather than for religion itself. So there are many other issues concerning the future in terms of how do technologies will act in this. How you will govern under conditions that are much more open if terrorism is stopped on time. How you move in countries where tribes are important. No tradition nor culture of democracy. Or there are regional fightings. And on the other side, there are positive factors that we didn't have at the time. For instance, the European Union, the role the European Union played when the Berlin Wall fell. So for Poland or for Czech Republic or for whatever, all the Eastern European countries, the existence of the European Union was crucial for moving towards democracy. And you have even today, of course, the African Union, Latin American organizations, they all move in that direction and can give some protection. You have a second factor that didn't exist at the time, the creation of the International Criminal Court, the Rome Agreement, and the possibility of taking somebody because of genocide and crimes of lesa humanidad. Well, that didn't exist. That, of course, it inhibits this things to happen. So there are new realities, but I'm convinced that these conclusions, other that come out from the book, will be very helpful for those people that are fighting for future democracy in new countries, or people in countries like Canada that are helping those to achieve their goals. Thank you.
Is my microphone on? Yes, my microphone is on. Thank you very much, Sergio. I'm going to pour you a glass of water because you must be thirsty after this presentation of your book that I think we can summarize as being part of a reading that could inspire and help future leaders and guide them on the experience that you have been through, but the experience also of the people that you have interviewed. Now, I think I'm going to go directly to the floor, and I'm going to ask people to identify themselves and use the microphone, because we are recorded to be put on our web eventually, so we want to hear your question. Would that be convenient for you, Sergio?
Yes, of course.
So please, sir.
Thank you very much. Mark Farron. I'm a consultant demographer, health, international development. I want to thank the IDRC and the speaker, Sergio Bitar, for the presentation. I have a strong sense of connection to the transition of Chile for the last 40 years. In 1977, I came to Santiago as a CIDA cooperant, working with the CEPAL, or the CELADI, and Demografia. And one of my colleagues, her name was Dr. Erika Tauher, MB, MD, and public health researcher, demographer. She invited me to her home on a Sunday afternoon, and her husband was Dr. Pedro Castillo, who was head of surgery department at the University of Chile and later a political prisoner. And they had 5 daughters. And at that time, no daughter was married. There were 4 of them were studying medicine. And so going to their house was like a postgraduate medical seminar on any given time. But it was also, very, as you would know, very engaged people. And we talked about everything. Once you have the intimacy and the trust. And I'm glad to say today it's now one of the daughters, of those 4 daughters, is now Minister of Health in Chile. So I think Chile has come a very long way, and to get the personal stories of that transition, and my own feelings in 1977 as an outsider, we would come in and seeing a very divided country. There was almost, oh, you're a foreigner, you know, either you were for or against, you had to be for or against, and of course we always had to dance around and say, well, we're not involved, and it's easier to be against something than for something, all this kind of language. But the question I have is, how do you feel about the rebuilding of reconciliation? I mean, the other dimensions you talked about, political, institutional, economic, they're all very important, but at the end of the day, it's really inside people's hearts, reconciliation. So how do you feel, what have been the important accomplishments and what remains to be done in that transition to reconciliation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to take another question.
Yes, thank you for the presentations, Gerald Schmitz, International Affairs Analyst. Just as a preface, I was in Mongolia last July during the Nadam national celebrations, and my companion was Belgian, so it was great to hear remarks from the ambassador of Mongolia and also former Belgian Prime Minister. I think we're all in solidarity with Belgium today in light of what's happened in Brussels. I want to, I have a serious question that I'll direct to Senor Bitar. I think when you look at the 10 lessons for leaders that you've drawn from this useful comparative analysis, I mean, they make a lot of sense, and I think they corroborate a lot of findings of recent decades of scholars of democratic development. At the same time, we're seeing maybe a more difficult environment than ever in a lot of places for continued democratization. Setbacks, the temptation to authoritarianism, that perhaps now the scourge of terrorism is increasing, and that sort of thing. And it makes me wonder, we have scholars like Larry Diamond, Thomas Carruthers in the States raising a lot of critical questions about their own country's approach to democracy promotion. And in Canada, we've seen a bit of a withdrawal almost from the field in the last decade. You know, the Montreal-based Rights and Democracy was closed by the previous government in 2012. So although I agree with you very much that democratic transitions have to be primarily domestically driven, I guess I'm going to put my question in terms of where does external support for transitions go now? And do you have any thoughts about what an international actor like Canada should do to, in the current environment, to support democratic forces in countries around the world? Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to take two other questions because I'd like you to think about what are the questions you want to answer and the answer you want to provide. Bia, Ambassador of Switzerland in Canada.
Sir, thank you very much for a very interesting introduction into a topic which, of course, is of the essence for all of us. You made mention of a need to include a way of reconciliation to sort of bridge conflict immediately in order to have a way forward. Now, my question takes us down maybe 10 years or a little more, and deals with the often thorny issue of dealing with the past. We have seen quite a number of attempts, also by international partners, to support countries or maybe even twist their arm a little bit when it came to the issue of actually dealing with that past. Have you noticed a best practice in terms of that? Or to ask the question even a bit more precisely, is it an absolute necessity to deal with the past, or would you rather say it might be advisable in order to maintain the narrative of that change for democracy to leave the past be? This is a question that is quite important for us. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm going to change my decision. We'll keep you for the next round, okay? So, Sergio, you want to go with these three questions, two that touches on reconciliation, best practice, absolute necessity, and the other one about, you know, at what point the external support and what type of external support might help or might not help.
Let me answer the issue of reconciliation first, because it's not, I won't answer through my logic, but with my heart, because I don't feel reconciled in my country, and I don't need to be reconciled, because for reconciliation, I think that word comes from the religion, the Christian church or whatever, means that you ask to be, the other will ask you to pardon him. Nobody has asked me to pardon anyone. And there are many people that were killed, human rights violated. So the way I approach is that first you have to create the conditions for unity within the country, that people will live with each other, and to establish institutional norms that can deal with polarization. So I can recognize another, I can work with another one, and I will make my best efforts to do it together. Among other things, for one reason: you cannot be a political leader if your soul is with the negative elements within. You cannot say, let's unite if you hate. You have to overcome those feelings within yourself, and to do that politically also. I think, for instance, in my country, I think we have managed. That's one thing. So probably if somebody will ask me to pardon him, I can say okay. But if nobody, wow, I'm going to say I pardon everybody and I am reconciliated with everybody. No, it's not a political need for that. But what political you have to do is to create the conditions for people to reconcile, but that's a personal decision. Now, I think my country is much better now. But still you see those things. Now, what can help you for doing that? How to manage that? You have to end with polarization. You have to create political conditions for understanding. You have to develop a culture for agreements. I know that there are people now that even are criticizing within our own coalitions, saying if you want to agree, that means that you are not strong enough. Well, I don't think so. You have your ideas, but I have to talk with the other one, because what I want is that I move ahead one step. This step is strong, and I don't go backward. So the other thing, it depends on the country. In many the issue of human rights violations are very important. So my feeling is that if a democracy is not capable to face justice, people don't trust democracy. That's my conviction. So I would also confess that many times I was in the Senate, and that was taking 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, and we are still moving on. And this guy was taken to prison, the military here, and there are lots of pressure to say, well, put an end to this. Put the timing, 2 more years, 3 more years, and then finish. And there was a temptation, but we had a movement of women in favor of human rights that will not accept, and they had power. We didn't do that. Well, we are still moving ahead. Yesterday, and I know that tomorrow there would be another sanction. Justice is dealing with things that happened 40 years ago. But my internal conviction is that has been very positive for democracy. Because you know that institutions are taking care. You don't have to feel vengeance in your own heart, because justice will work and the conditions will improve. So that's the way I approach. What worries me is memory, what I said. And that's a Latin American problem. If a country loses memory, makes the same mistakes and the same horrors, not solo errores, as we say in Spanish, but horrores. We need now. There are countries, for instance, Brazil, they had an amnesty. Nothing happened later. And Dilma tried, in the last 3 years, he built a new commission asking to start reviewing the cases. Well, this is almost, I talked to the guy who was the secretary of that commission, and he said that he had received lots of threats for his life. But it didn't move much. The Argentinians moved, then they stopped, they put a law of punto final, and then they came back, and they went very far up in front. They put in jail one of the General Videla, the guy who was the strong man of the junta. So you have different. Spain, well, there was this amnesty, and that's it. So it depends. The Polish, Mazowiecki, when we interviewed him, he said, we asked him, what about human rights? Well, of course, when you have such sort of occupation of your country, things are different than when they are in the... But anyhow, he defined a policy that was what he called the thick line. I will pass, he said, 2 or 3 months after he came to power, a thick line, and we will move from here to the future. We will not look at the past. Chile created the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation. Then Mandela asked people of Chile to go there, and they created the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation. And today, if you see many African countries, there are at least 20, 30 countries that have Truth and Reconciliation, but the interpretation of this commission is different. In our case, what was done was the list of people, and that's it. And this went to the justice. And justice started doing research and sanctioning and putting people in jail. In the case of South Africa, what I understand, or what we read and talked to them, etc., is that they moved in a way that the people that were in the list or did violations of human rights, they had to go and recognize what they did. And that's it. So it depends very much on but that's my feeling. So democracy needs understanding, democracy needs working together, democracy needs ending hate, and that's what you have to build. That's a democracy. Now, each one can think, I pardon, I don't pardon, I'm reconciliated, I am not. We came out with a book last year in Chile. They asked many leaders, are you reconciled? And I answered what I'm telling you. Others said that they were. So it depends on each one.
What about external support, Sergio? You know, is this positive? Or
now, on the external support, today, I would say, first, to be there. So if you see people coming, if you see people from other countries and democracy organizations that are there, that are opening space, that finance a seminar, finance a discussion, that help a political party, but that comes from them, ask you, but you have to go. I think that's quite important. Building international institutions that push for democracy, that threat a guy who's using violence within his country and violating human rights, as we have done. There is a commission against torture in the United Nations, so it could be very active also. That helps also. Then I would say the protection of given specific people. For instance, I may not agree with Leopoldo Lopez, the guy who's in prison in Venezuela, politically, but that's not acceptable. You cannot have this guy in prison because he's a threat to what, and the justice system has not worked. So international pressure on that is very important. The government must realize governments are very sensitive to international pressure on issues of justice and human rights. So those are some aspects. So you can use international instruments that you didn't have before, and you can help those groups like think tanks and others to progress and see each situation. But you have to build the trust with the people inside the country that can then come to you and ask for support, not that you go and say what you think it has to be done.
Thank you. Madame, you had a question, and you had a question.
I'm Barb Darling, former president of the Canadian International Council in Ottawa, and consultant in strategic country governance in the developing world. And I apologize that I was unfortunately late, though I've had a chance to look at some of your materials earlier. I find that generally what you have to say I can't disagree with. I think it's all very helpful. But there's one area that, in my experience, I found very difficult. It's where you have the combination, and it goes back to your comment about you, I think, would argue that it's the political dynamic that causes things to change, that leads to the transition. If I take the three legs of the economy, the political, and by political, I'd like to go beyond that and talk about the power distribution. And in cases, you try to look at which of the three causes the instability that leads to the change. And in my experience, I've seen situations where the economy starts to decline in some form or another. The power distribution, which can be full of fault lines, it can be religious, ethnic, income distribution. It can be external relationships as well. It can be under the table, over the table, whatever. But when you take that mix, and I find that the major underpinning becomes that some shift in that power distribution, but usually on the economic side, and especially where you have an autocracy. And usually the reaction at the power is to do something that leads to a political imbalance. Now, I'm generalizing, but I just want to argue with you a little bit on the economic and the political balance of change.
Thank you. And that will be our last question this afternoon, so you're very privileged.
Thank you. My name is Ruby Daher. I'm from the University of Ottawa. I teach over there. I also do a lot of research on post-conflict development, and one thing always comes to my mind, especially in post-conflict cases, and one of the things that I've noticed from the presentation is the sous-entendu, is that there are leaders that want change. So what do you do in cases where leaders don't necessarily want the change? Is there a way to, work with them behaviorally or entice them in certain ways or in certain directions other than asking the people to revolt or helping the people with the revolt and asking for external support? Do you see if, we've seen democratic transitions in Afghanistan that have failed, democratic transitions in Lebanon that have failed, and all over, and one of the key things is the abuse of power or the control of state institutions or whatnot. The list is very long. And so the key issue then is the behavior of these leaders that have transitioned from a position of power to a position where they have to succumb to power. And so what is the incentivization? Is there one, potentially? And if there is, what would it be?
Merci. Thank you. Sergio.
Let me show you here that I didn't show. Those are the numbers concerning the progress of democracy. So the blue line is between 1950 and 2010, democracies, according to this source. Autocracies is the green one. And he's called anocracies, the man, so some sort of hybrid system. And then here is the Freedom House classification of countries according to the Democratic Index. And so they qualify 50 countries as authoritarian. So when I read this list, I said, there is a lot of job to do. 50. Out of 180, only 20 are considered democracies. And another 50, 40, and my country is in that group. I thought that we were in the 20. It's flawed democracies. And then, well, so there is a lot of things to do, but you see that the majority of those are Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And there are situations completely different from Latin America or from Europe, or because there are different cultures there. There is a cultural problem also on how you deal with this. I don't know well, but I wanted to show you this. Having said that, now, concerning the issue of, let me say a few things concerning the issue of power distribution, the economy, and successes and failures. And let's go to power distribution. Now, the main problem, for instance, in the region of Latin America, is power distribution and the concentration of power and the link between concentration of wealth and politics. So the big fighting that is taking place in Brazil, well, in Mexico is somehow the same thing. The fight against corruption. What means corruption? The use of power in the mixture of concentration of economic power and political power for advantages and abuses concerning others. And the majority of the population now is more wise, is more informed, is more educated. So this is changing. And that has to do with distribution of power. And in all countries, distribution of power, political power, has to do with distribution of economic power, because of this link between politics and money. So I think that's a major problem coming in the future, and it's more transparent than before. And of course, in order to achieve a better income distribution, you need to change the structure of power. And as far as you stay, also you advance in terms of economic distribution and tax reforms, you produce better conditions for distribution of power and democracy. So there is interaction between economics and politics and the distribution of power. So what I see now coming is more progress in terms of new institutions that produce more power distribution and more power to the citizens, more control on the money. In our case, for instance, we just passed a law 1 month ago that forbids money for campaigns coming from companies. I don't know how one is going to finance the campaign, but we have increased the fiscal participation in financing campaigns. So that's one thing that I can say. On this, we analyzed 9 cases of success, but there are lots of cases of failure. And why they failed? There is no rules for all these things that we are talking about. It's a very complex thing. You have some criteria to approach, but I would say that has to first that's a long process. There are no magic things concerning democracy. It's a building of a culture, of institutions, of a way of living. So that's why when you see the Arab world today, you cannot say it's dead. So a friend of us, and a Belgian friend of Yves, whose name is Lebel, he wrote a piece that I thought very interesting. He said, why do you criticize so much the Arab Spring and the changes? Look at what happened after the French Revolution. It took 70 years, 80 years, and he mentioned about 5 or 6 new constitutions in the period. And then Napoleon III, and so it takes lots of time. Well, he was doing that example to call the attention. But I think timing is very important. That's why you need to be persistent, and it has to be international organization to keep working on that, helping on that. And then the issue of tribes and nation. Something that we don't know much on how to build that. But of course, I think in Africa that's an important factor. Even in Myanmar, if you look at the map of Myanmar, of the different groups, different languages. So to have all that together, it's not easy. But you have the case of India. How many languages, how many groups, and they have a very interesting democracy going for more than 1,000 million people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thank you for the rich conversation. Members of Parliament, Excellency from the Diplomatic Corps, thank you very much for joining us. Yves Leterme, Secrétaire Général, IDEA, merci.
IDEA Secretary General, thank you for having published this book.
Parler du livre.
Sergio, thank you for coming here to talk to the book.
And I couldn't take out of my mind the fact that you're also an engineer. And after the French Revolution, there were those popular tribunal, and where, you know, priests were called in front of the popular tribunal and were accused of committing crime against the people. And popular tribunal, you know, said la guillotine. So the priest went on the guillotine. The bourreau pulled the rope, but the blade's tall. So he was grace. And then it was the lawyer that was corrupted and has, you know, taken decision against the people. So in front of the tribunal, you know, the lawyer was judged for his crime and sent to the guillotine. Here again, the bourreau pulled the rope. The blade's tall. He has grace. There was some noise in the crowd. Then come the engineer. For the fact that he has built, you know, some weapons, has helped to conquer the people. So he's judged by the tribunal, and he goes to the guillotine. He goes in the guillotine, stand there, says, oh, I see where's the problem. Well, you know, you have showed this afternoon, Sergio, that you are an engineer. But, you know, the humility you show and also the tolerance. When I was hearing you answering the question about reconciliation, it takes more than, you know, rational argument. It takes the heart, it takes the practice, and it takes a vision for the future. And that you have brought in spade today. So thank you very much for your presence. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.